Women in politics is still considered by many to be taboo. Here in the U.S., we have failed to see a female president, vice president, or speaker of the House. However, there's countries all over the world where women have held and maintained power in their countries. One such instance is India, which saw Indira Gandhi act as its prime minister for nearly 3 decades. Indira's reign is the stuff that great novels are written of. It had power, corruption, reform, peace, and growth. Indira had many supporters and continues to have much influence over India even to this day after her passing. In 1999, the BBC named her Woman of the Millennium. In 2001, she was voted the greatest Indian Prime Minister by India Today. Indira Gandhi's life began in 1917 on November 19th. She was born in Allahabad to the then Prime Minister of the country. Her schooling was at home, but she had many of the greatest private tutors until she went away to college at Bharati University. She would have to leave almost a year later, though, to take care of her ailing mother. She eventually went back and studied this time at the University of Oxford. However, more trying times were ahead of her as she became ill herself and Europe became at war with Germany. It did have some silver linings as she did meet and marry her husband, Feroz Gandhi. And by the 1950s, after the tumultuous times of college and so on, she was ready to take a position at her father's side as his assistant. However, in 1964, he passed away. This left an opening in Congress, and she was elected onto that seat. She quickly rose through the ranks, becoming the Minister of Communication and Broadcasting. Eventually, the country saw a divide in its politics, forming two factions. The first faction was a socialist faction, in which Indira was part of, and the other was a conservative faction. In 1964, the faction that Indira was part of, the socialist faction, was the leading part of Congress, and fortunately the Prime Minister at that time passed away, promoting Indira to be the head of that faction and the head of Congress, therefore becoming the Prime Minister of India. Unfortunately, Indira inherited a country with little identity and in the process of a near economic collapse. A year later, though, she was officially elected into the role, but the downside to it was many of the other seats in Congress were filled by the Conservative Party. Right away, she knew that she had to create social and economic reform in her country, as well as deal with outside influences. She quickly became a member of the world stage of politics, trying to gain foreign aid from the United States. The United States agreed to help out India. However, after she spoke out against the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, that aid was quickly shut off. Indira also then had to take part in the Pakistani civil war that was going on next to her. She eventually had to side, and she did, with the East Pakistan coalition. The East Pakistanis broke off, formed their own country, now known as Bangladesh. This left Indira to figure out what to do with economic and social reform in her country. She created a plan to nationalize the banks. The banks of India at that time were all privately owned and operated. This created a class system, poor class and banking class. Poor class was very skeptical and did not want to put money into the banking community. However, after the nationalization of 14 banks that Indira oversaw, those branches went up exponentially, as did their account holders, which were made up of many of those poorer class people who were reluctant before to store their money within the banks. She then went on to unite her country, who was in the middle of a war over what the national language should be. Many of the Indians felt that the national language should be Hindi now that they were no longer under British rule. However, a large population never learned how to speak Hindi and only knew English. So in the end, Indira chose to make both languages the national language, thus making the country bilingual. It wasn't soon after that she was at arms up with Pakistan again over her nuclear tests. Pakistan felt that Indira and India's nuclear program was an attempt to sway them and intimidate them in the stage of world politics. Despite all the good that she did to try and build her country, there were a lot of issues going on within it as far as the political arena was concerned. There were many factions forming and sub-factions of those factions, and almost all of them were against Indira. They all accused her of political corruption, and eventually she was even charged with bribery. Indira had said that no matter what the conviction would be, it would not sway her or stop her from being prime minister. She was so convinced that come 1977, in those elections, she thought she would win by a landslide, but unfortunately lost her seat in Congress, thus not being the prime minister any longer. Soon after, she was arrested for charges of political corruption. This, however, worked against the Conservatives' plan to get Indira out of the stage of politics in India, as many of the Indians began to feel empathy for Indira, and the fact that the ruling party at that time, the Jahara party, was again splintering and losing control of the nation. They re-elected Indira onto Congress, and shortly after that, more elections were held where her party, the Socialist Party, once again took power, elevating her to becoming the focal leader again in India. However, once she once again became Prime Minister of the country, she inherited more issues. As many of the factions had broken off, some of those factions had become violent and militant. One of the factions, the Sikh faction, was probably the worst and most violent faction out of those. Having no other choice, Indira organized an attack against the Sikh at their holiest shrine, the Golden Shrine, temple in Amritsar. This caused the death of 450 followers of that faction, and the eventual death of Indira as two of her own bodyguards, who were members of the Sikh faction, assassinated her. In the end, Indira's influence in India can be seen everywhere. Her time as India's leader saw great changes to the culture and economics for the country, and her legacy lives on even today. The New Delhi airport is named the Indira Gandhi International Airport, and the Indira Gandhi International Open University is the largest university in the world. Indira stood tall and uncompromising in a world largely compiled of men, and did her way, which led to India becoming a leader in the stage of world politics and forever cementing her spot in the arena of politics, proving that women can be strong leaders in the stage of world economics and world politics.